Okay, let me now conclude the whole of the talk. Contemporary interpretations of the Redlands Affair broadly correspond to subsequent historiographical models of permissiveness in the 1960s. These may be termed the hell in a handbasket model of conservative moralists, the Paradise Lost model of disillusioned radicals, the onwards and upwards model of liberal progressives, and the storm in a teacup model of sceptical mythbusters. The hell in a handbasket model equates permissiveness with moral decline, that smell of decadence detected by the Daily Mail as emanating from the Redlands mansion. Conservative moralists contrasted a moral majority, what the magistrate Justice Block termed his fellow countrymen, with a deviant but insurgent minority. Columnist Bernard Levin duly warned that Richards's rejection of petty morals was indicative of a broader moral relativism among the young. Conservatives charged the liberal establishment with aiding and abetting the Stones. News of the World editor Stafford Summerfield accused nameless figures of excusing any aberration and condoning every outrage against normally accepted standards of conduct. Tory demagogue Quintin Hogg more specifically lambasted the Times for publishing the Somerad and Tom Dryburgh for signing it, thereby exhibiting moral blindness and perversity which disgraces the name of a Christian country. Age betrays youth, he thundered, much as Christopher Booker's instant history, The Neophiliacs of 1969, pilloried the absurd cult of youth on display in the World in Action debate. Whereas conservative moralists perceived the Redlands Affair as a victory for the counterculture, many counterculturalists claimed the exact opposite. Oz portrayed the affair to be part of a wholesale, square backlash to be placed alongside the private prosecution of Last Exit to Brooklyn, and the rough passage accorded to bills liberalising abortion and male homosexuality. Keith Richards's assertion that the police were more and more concerned with how you live resembled a rough draft of the more sophisticated models of moral panic to be developed in the 1970s by the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies. And Richards and Faithfull's autobiographies provided a narrative of decline and fall akin to that of other countercultural accounts, with the affair depicted as the decisive moment when the establishment turned against the counterculture. The onwards and upwards model was exemplified by William Rees-Mogg, who credited himself with preventing a miscarriage of justice and engaged in dialogue with leaders of the rising generation. The overturning of the jail sentences of Jagger and Richards was cited by liberals at the time as displaying what Arthur Marwick would later dub measured judgment. The more optimistic members of the counterculture were similarly Whiggish in their conviction that the drugs laws will change and we will win. The storm in a teacup model was best expressed at the time by George Melley's Revolt into Style of 1970, which argued that the counterculture was not so subversive, nor the state so repressive, as each accused the other of being. Melley cited the fact that only the right to smoke pot has stung the pop world into protest, as testament both to the comparatively permissive attitude of the authorities and to pop music's limited challenge to the status quo. Dorian Lynskey has recently endorsed Melley's verdict in his Philippic against the Stones as rock's fake rebels. And for his part, Dominic Sandbrook has portrayed all parties in the Redlands Affair as guilty of overreacting. He characterises the Stones as having often led much more conservative lives than people imagined, while at the same time dismissing as ridiculous their belief that they were scapegoats for the permissive society. Now, these four accounts of permissiveness are not exhaustive, nor are they mutually exclusive, so that someone as mercurial as Jagger endorsed elements of each. He was by turns moralistic when berating others for encouraging young people to take drugs, pessimistic when stating that freedom of the individual is being slowly curtailed, optimistic when predicting that in the year 2000 no one will be arrested for drugs, and dismissive and light-hearted when claiming we love you to be just a bit of fun. None of these models accords with my understanding of the Redlands Affair, or of permissiveness as a whole. Conservative moralists are at a loss to explain why a putatively liberal establishment did not decriminalise recreational drugs. On the contrary, the only politicians publicly defending the Stones in 1967 were Tom Dryburgh and fellow maverick Lord Moynihan. And the debate on the Wootton Report 2 years later found, as the Times put it, the two front benches united as seldom before in total condemnation of any moves towards a more lenient attitude to drugs. Roy Jenkins, who is the moralist's favourite scapegoat for moral decline, authorised the outlawing of LSD, endorsed the Brain Committee's restrictions on the permissive system, and defended the handcuffing of Jagger and Fraser in his capacity as Home Secretary. There was no mention of drug users in his vision of a civilised society. Claims of an anti-permissive backlash face the opposite problem of explaining away permissive reforms in other fields. Oz's alarmist prophecy went unfulfilled, as the appeals court overturned the verdicts against both the Stones and Last Exit to Brooklyn, and the Abortion Act and Sexual Offences Act made it to the statute book. A similar paranoia skewed Richards and Faithfull's accounts of the Redlands Affair. Each advanced conspiracy theories which were not only factually inaccurate, but internally contradictory. Richards failed to provide a plausible reason for why the establishment switched from persecuting the Stones to appeasing them, like Chamberlain. Sandbrook's explanation that there was no such thing as a single united establishment doesn't seem to have occurred to Richards. But he's more on the mark when he sees that the moral panic surrounding the Redlands Affair did not turn him into a folk devil, to use the terminology of Stanley Cohen. The judge managed to turn me into some sort of folk hero overnight, he remarked, thereby corroborating Sarah Thornton's contention that moral panics often have the effect of certifying transgression and legitimising youth cultures. As for liberals, Abram has observed how they overstate their own importance in the Redlands Affair, and I quote, "The official history of the Times asserts that the issue with the Butterfly leader was handed to Jagger in prison by a warder, with the advice that he could now expect to be released on bail. But in fact, Jagger and Richards had been released the previous day." Measured judgment is difficult to discern in those passing the drug laws, who on occasion admitted themselves to be ignorant and their legislation to be inadequate. And measured judgment was similarly rare among those enforcing the law, as various members of the police and the judiciary acted at cross purposes. In truth, the authorities and the press had little control over the situation. The ineffectiveness of even the most stringent of laws showed that permissiveness required no government fiat. Sanctioned or not, recreational drug use was here to stay. The visceral anti-authoritarianism of the Stones and their supporters lead me to reject interpretations which diminish the significance of the Redlands Affair. The counterculture lived up to its name by seeking alternative ways of living and thinking. It developed its own worldview, moral code, institutions, and hierarchies. Drugs and popular music were integral to the scene, which is why the Redlands Affair galvanised the counterculture as never before. We should be careful not to let underground heroes dominate our depictions of the 60s, for they were often estranged from the society in which they lived. Yet the Stones, and for that matter the Beatles, attracted controversy and unpopularity because of their very prominence, which, like the drugs they used, by no means disappeared in subsequent decades. So, in this talk, I've sought to nuance the concept of permissiveness in a number of respects. I've emphasised its provisional nature in 60s Britain, showing it to be on trial in every sense of the word. I've argued that permissiveness wasn't one package to be embraced or rejected, however much it's been portrayed as such in the ongoing culture wars. I've also critiqued a number of influential models of permissiveness, though offer no overarching model of my own. The Redlands Affair shows permissiveness in 60s Britain to have been a morality play performed before an audience of millions, and, to some extent, by them. How do you measure permissiveness, mused Mick Jagger in 1987. The Redlands Affair shows how complicated, any answer must be.